In the year 73 before the Common Era, in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius, a gladiator named Spartacus stood in his cell and made a decision that would shake the Roman Republic to its very foundations. A decision that would transform him from a nameless slave into a legend whose name would echo through millennia. A decision that would ignite the most terrifying slave rebellion Rome had ever witnessed. The stone walls of the gladiatorial school at Capua were thick, designed to contain men trained to kill, men who were considered property, less than human in the eyes of Roman law. Yet these walls would soon prove insufficient to contain the fury of the oppressed. Spartacus was not born a slave. He had once been a free man, possibly a Thracian warrior from the rugged mountains of what is now Bulgaria. A man who knew the taste of freedom before it was stolen from him, before he was captured, enslaved, and forced into the blood-soaked sand of the arena where men died for the entertainment of Roman crowds. His body bore the scars of countless battles, his muscles hardened by relentless training, his mind sharpened by the constant proximity of death, and in his eyes burned something the Romans had not anticipated, an unquenchable desire for liberty. The ludus, or gladiatorial school, where Spartacus was imprisoned belonged to a man named Lentulus Batiatus, a lanista who bought, sold, and trained human beings for profit, treating them as investments rather than people, calculating their worth in terms of how many spectators they could thrill and how much coin they could generate before their inevitable deaths. Inside these walls lived approximately 200 gladiators, men from every corner of the known world. Thracians, Gauls, Germans, Greeks, Africans, all united by their bondage, all marked by the brand of slavery, all knowing that each day could be their last. The conditions were brutal beyond modern comprehension. Gladiators lived in cramped cells, were fed barely enough to maintain their fighting strength, were subjected to savage training regimens, and were denied even the most basic human dignities. They were sexual property, used and abused by their masters and sometimes rented out to wealthy Romans seeking exotic pleasures. They had no rights, no legal standing, no future beyond the next fight. Yet among this population of the damned, Spartacus began to whisper of something impossible, something that most slaves dared not even dream. Escape, freedom, rebellion. The Roman Republic in 73 BC was at the height of its power, having conquered vast territories around the Mediterranean, having subjugated countless peoples, having built an empire on the backs of slaves who outnumbered free citizens in many regions. Slavery was not merely an institution in Rome. It was the foundation of the entire economic and social system, the engine that drove agriculture, mining, construction, domestic service, and entertainment. Estimates suggest that Italy contained between 1 and 2 million slaves at this time, perhaps a third of the total population, and these people lived in conditions ranging from relatively comfortable household service to the living hell of the mines and the arena. The Romans viewed slavery as natural, ordained by the gods, a reflection of the conquered people's inherent inferiority. To be a slave was to be a thing, not a person, and Roman law reflected this philosophy, treating slaves as property that could be bought, sold, used, abused, and destroyed at the owner's whim. Runaway slaves were branded, mutilated, or crucified, with thousands of crosses lining Roman roads as warnings to others who might consider flight. The very idea of slaves rising in organized rebellion was almost unthinkable, yet it was not unprecedented. Twice before in the previous decades, slave revolts in Sicily had required military intervention to suppress, though these uprisings had been localized and ultimately crushed with overwhelming force. But what Spartacus was planning would dwarf these earlier rebellions, would threaten the very heart of Roman power, would demonstrate that the empire built on human bondage was far more fragile than the Romans believed. On a night in early 73 BC, as the city of Capua slept, Spartacus and approximately 70 fellow gladiators made their move. The exact details of their escape have been lost to time, transformed by legend and romantic embellishment, but ancient sources agree on the essential facts. The gladiators somehow acquired weapons, overpowered their guards, fought their way out of the ludus, and fled into the Italian countryside. Some accounts suggest they used cooking implements and kitchen knives, others mention smuggled weapons. What matters is that these trained killers, men who had survived countless battles in the arena, proved more than capable of defeating the guards who had grown complacent in their perceived security. The initial group of 70 quickly grew as they liberated slaves from the farms and villas surrounding Capua. And within days, hundreds of men and women had joined what was rapidly becoming an army. Spartacus emerged as the natural leader, chosen not through hereditary right or political maneuvering, but through demonstrated capability, courage, and charisma. He possessed military experience, tactical genius, and the ability to inspire desperate people to believe in the possibility of freedom. Alongside him rose two other leaders: Crixus, a Gaul whose ferocity in battle was matched by his hatred of Rome, and Enemaus, another Gaul whose strategic mind complemented Spartacus's battlefield prowess. Together, these three men began organizing what had started as a desperate flight into something far more dangerous: a disciplined military. The fugitives fled to Mount Vesuvius, the volcano that would centuries later destroy Pompeii, but in 73 BC stood as a natural fortress with steep slopes, defensible positions, and ample resources. The Romans, initially dismissing this as a minor disturbance that could be easily suppressed, dispatched a force of approximately 3,000 militia under the command of Gaius Claudius Glaber, a praetor who viewed this assignment as beneath his dignity, an opportunity for easy glory against rabble who barely deserved to be called opponents. Glaber surrounded the base of the mountain, settled in to starve the rebels out, and waited confidently for their surrender, never imagining that he was about to suffer one of the most humiliating defeats in Roman military history. Spartacus, surveying the Roman positions from above, recognized that his forces were trapped, outnumbered, and poorly armed, yet he also saw opportunity. The Romans had blocked the obvious paths down the mountain but had left the steep, vine-covered rear slopes unwatched, assuming they were impassable. In a move that would become legendary, Spartacus ordered his men to weave ropes from wild vines, and under cover of darkness, the rebels descended the sheer cliff face, a feat of daring and desperation that the Romans never anticipated. At dawn, while Glaber's forces remained focused on the front of the mountain, Spartacus attacked from behind, sweeping down on the Roman camp with savage fury, catching the militia completely by surprise. The battle was short, brutal, and utterly one-sided. The Romans, roused from sleep and attacked from an unexpected direction, broke and fled in panic, abandoning their weapons, supplies, and dignity. Spartacus's forces claimed a stunning victory, seizing Roman military equipment that transformed them from a band of fugitives into a properly armed fighting force. News of this defeat sent shockwaves through Roman society. Slaves had not merely escaped but had defeated Roman soldiers, had humiliated a praetor, had demonstrated that they could fight and win. The Senate, alarmed but not yet terrified, dispatched another force, this time under Publius Varinius, another praetor who was determined not to repeat Glaber's mistakes. Varinius brought a larger force, moved more cautiously, and employed more sophisticated tactics, yet he too would discover that Spartacus was no ordinary opponent. The rebel leader had been using the time since his first victory to train his growing army, instilling discipline, teaching tactics, organizing supply lines, and transforming desperate slaves into soldiers who fought not for pay or glory but for something far more powerful: their freedom and the freedom of their families. When Varinius's forces located the rebel army, they found not a disorganized mob but a structured military organization with scouts, sentries, and tactical formations. The resulting engagements demonstrated Spartacus's growing confidence and capability. Using guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and rapid maneuvers, the rebels repeatedly outfought and outthought the Roman forces, inflicting defeat after defeat on Varinius's legions. In one particularly audacious move, Spartacus captured Varinius's own horse and equipment, a symbolic humiliation that resonated throughout Italy. By the end of 73 BC, the The rebel army had swelled to approximately 70,000 followers, including not just escaped gladiators and slaves, but also impoverished free people who saw in Spartacus an alternative to the crushing poverty and exploitation of Roman society. The composition of this army reflected the diversity of Rome's enslaved population. Thracians, Gauls, Germans, Greeks, Syrians, Africans, men and women from dozens of conquered peoples, united by their common bondage and their shared dream of freedom. Spartacus established camps where families could live together, where children could grow up free, where people could reclaim their humanity after years or lifetimes of dehumanization. The rebels raided Roman farms and villas, liberating more slaves, seizing supplies, and punishing slave owners with a violence that mirrored the violence inflicted upon the enslaved. In some cases, captured Romans were forced to fight as gladiators for the rebels' entertainment, a reversal of roles that must have been both terrifying and darkly satisfying for those who had suffered in the arena. Yet Spartacus was not merely conducting raids. He was moving his army northward through Italy, heading toward the Alps and the freedom that lay beyond, hoping to lead his followers out of Roman territory entirely, to give them the chance to return to their homelands and live as free people. This strategic vision set Spartacus apart from earlier slave rebels. He was not seeking to overthrow Rome or establish a rival state, but simply to escape Roman power, to win freedom through departure rather than conquest. However, not all of his followers shared this vision. Many, particularly the Gauls under Crixus, wanted revenge, wanted to burn Rome itself, wanted to make the Romans suffer as they had suffered. This tension between escape and vengeance would ultimately contribute to the rebellion's downfall. But in late 73 BC, with victory following victory, the rebel army seemed unstoppable. The Roman Senate, no longer able to dismiss this threat as a minor disturbance, began to panic. The defeats inflicted by Spartacus's army were not merely military setbacks. They struck at the psychological foundations of Roman power, challenged the ideology of Roman superiority, and raised terrifying questions about the stability of a society built on slavery. If slaves could defeat Roman legions, if they could organize, fight, and win, then what did that say about Roman invincibility? What prevented other slaves, the hundreds of thousands throughout Italy and the empire, from rising in similar revolt? The specter of total slave insurrection, of the entire enslaved population turning on their masters, haunted the Roman elite, kept them awake at night, forced them to see the people they had treated as property suddenly revealed as dangerous enemies. The Senate responded by appointing both consuls for the year 72 BC to lead campaigns against Spartacus. Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus each commanded armies of approximately 10,000 legionaries, professional soldiers who were supposed to make quick work of the slave rebels. The Romans were so confident of victory that they divided their forces, with the consuls approaching from different directions to trap the rebels between them, a classic pincer movement that should have crushed any ordinary enemy. But Spartacus was not ordinary, and his army had become a formidable military force, battle-hardened and highly motivated. When the consuls' armies converged, they found the rebels ready and willing to fight. The battles that followed shocked Rome to its core. Not only did Spartacus's forces hold their ground, they defeated both consular armies, scattering the legions and forcing the consuls to retreat in disgrace. The victories were so complete, so unexpected, so contrary to everything Romans believed about their own military superiority, that some began to wonder if the gods themselves had turned against Rome. In the midst of these campaigns, tragedy struck the rebel army when Crixus, leading a force of approximately 30,000 Gauls and Germans who had separated from the main army to conduct their own raids and pursue their own vendetta against Rome, was defeated and killed by Gellius's forces near Mount Garganus. Spartacus, despite whatever tensions may have existed between them, honored his fallen comrade by forcing captured Roman soldiers to fight as gladiators at Crixus's funeral games. A powerful statement that inverted Roman customs and demonstrated that the former slaves now held the power of life and death over their former masters. This gesture was both a tribute and a warning, a reminder that the balance of power had shifted in ways the Romans had never imagined possible. By mid-72 BC, Spartacus's army had reached the northernmost regions of Italy, had crossed the Apennine Mountains, had approached the Alps and the gateway to freedom beyond. Some ancient sources claim that Spartacus successfully led his forces across the Alps and dispersed them to return to their homelands. But the more reliable accounts indicate that something changed, that the rebel leader turned back south instead of continuing to freedom. The reasons for this fateful decision remain debated by historians. Perhaps Spartacus's followers refused to leave Italy, preferring the familiar territory where they had won so many victories to the uncertain journey through the mountains and beyond. Perhaps some convinced him that they were strong enough to defeat Rome entirely, to march on the city itself and overthrow the Republic. Perhaps Spartacus himself recognized that the Romans would never allow them to escape peacefully, that legions would pursue them beyond the Alps, that true freedom could only be won through total victory. Whatever the reason, the decision to turn south would prove catastrophic, transforming what might have been a successful escape into a prolonged campaign that would eventually allow Rome to concentrate overwhelming force against the rebels. The Senate, desperate and humiliated by the continued defeats, turned to Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest men in Rome, a skilled politician and commander who saw in this crisis an opportunity to enhance his own power and prestige. Crassus was granted command of 8 legions, approximately 40,000 men, with authority to raise more forces as needed. He was given resources, support, and most importantly, the implicit understanding that failure was not acceptable, that Rome's very survival as a slave-owning society depended on crushing this rebellion completely. Crassus proved to be a different kind of opponent than the praetor and consuls who had failed before him. He was ruthless, calculating, and willing to employ the harshest measures to restore discipline to the Roman forces and terror to the rebel ranks. When one of his legions broke and fled in the face of rebel attack, Crassus revived the ancient practice of decimation, dividing the 500 survivors into groups of 10 and forcing them to draw lots, after which the unlucky one in 10 was beaten to death by his fellow soldiers. This brutal act, which shocked even Romans accustomed to military discipline, sent a clear message that fleeing from slaves was more dangerous than fighting them, that Roman soldiers had more to fear from their own commander than from the enemy. Crassus then set about training his forces relentlessly, rebuilding their confidence, and planning a campaign that would not seek to defeat Spartacus in open battle, where the rebels had proven so effective, but would instead trap, contain, and gradually destroy the rebel army through attrition and isolation. The campaign that followed demonstrated both Crassus's military acumen and the growing desperation of Spartacus's position. The rebel army, now possibly numbering 120,000 including women, children, and non-combatants, moved south toward the toe of Italy, perhaps hoping to cross to Sicily, where earlier slave revolts had found some success, or perhaps simply running out of options as Roman forces closed in from multiple directions. Crassus pursued methodically, avoiding direct confrontation, harassing the rebels, cutting off their supplies, and most ingeniously, building a massive fortification across the narrowest part of the Italian peninsula in Bruttium, effectively trapping the rebel army in the southern tip of Italy. This wall, stretching some 37 miles from sea to sea, consisted of a 15-foot-deep trench backed by a wooden palisade, manned by legionaries determined to prevent any rebel escape. It was an engineering feat that demonstrated Roman organizational capability and Crassus's determination to end the rebellion through containment rather than confrontation. Spartacus found himself trapped, his army confined to an increasingly small area, supplies running short, options diminishing with each passing day. In desperation, he attempted to negotiate passage to Sicily with Cilician pirates, offering them considerable payment to transport his forces across the strait, but the pirates took the gold and betrayed him, sailing away and leaving the rebels stranded. This betrayal highlighted the isolation of Spartacus's army. While individual Romans might sympathize privately with the slaves' plight, no established power was willing to ally with or assist a slave rebellion that threatened the fundamental structure of Mediterranean society. Facing starvation and knowing that surrender meant crucifixion, Spartacus made a daring attempt to break through Crassus's wall. On a snowy winter night, his forces filled part of the trench with earth, fascines, and even the bodies of animals, then charged across, fighting through the Roman positions and breaking free of the containment. It was another demonstration of Spartacus's tactical brilliance and his army's desperate courage, but it was ultimately only a temporary escape, buying time but not solving the fundamental problem. They were still trapped in Italy with Roman armies closing in. As the rebellion entered its final phase in 71 BC, the strategic situation had become hopeless for the rebels. Crassus received reinforcements and political pressure as the Senate, fearing the glory of defeating Spartacus might go entirely to Crassus, recalled Pompey the Great from Spain and Marcus Lucullus from Macedonia, ordering them to bring their legions to Italy to assist in crushing the rebellion. For Crassus, this was both help and threat. While additional forces would make victory more certain, if Pompey or Lucullus arrived before the rebels were defeated, they might claim credit for the victory, diminishing Crassus's political gains. This created urgency for Crassus to defeat Spartacus quickly, before his rivals could arrive and steal his glory. Spartacus, recognizing that time was running out, that his army was trapped between multiple Roman forces, that escape was impossible and surrender meant death, made the decision to force a final confrontation, to seek victory or death in one last great battle. The ancient sources differ on some details, but they agree on the essential tragedy. Rather than continue fleeing, Spartacus turned his army to face Crassus's legions, choosing to fight even knowing that defeat was probable, that his forces were outnumbered and exhausted, that this would almost certainly be the end. Some historians interpret this as desperation, others as nobility, a refusal to die running, a determination to meet death as a warrior rather than as a fugitive. Before the battle, in a gesture heavy with symbolism, Spartacus killed his horse, declaring that if they won, he would have many horses to choose from among Roman officers' mounts, and if they lost, he would need no horse at all. It was the statement of a man who understood that this was the final throw of the dice, that there would be no retreat, no tomorrow, only victory or death. The final battle took place near the Seal River in Lucania in 71 BC, and it was as brutal and desperate as one might imagine. Spartacus's forces, numbering perhaps 60,000 combatants, faced Crassus's legions of similar or greater size, professional soldiers with superior equipment, training, and support. The rebels fought with the fury of people who knew they were fighting for their lives and the lives of their families, with nothing to lose and everything to gain, while the Romans fought with the determination of men who knew that defeat by slaves would be an unforgivable shame, that victory was essential to restore Roman honor and maintain the slave system that underpinned their entire society. Spartacus himself fought in the front lines, seeking out Crassus personally, trying to cut the head from the Roman army, battling his way through ranks of legionaries with incredible courage and skill, killing 2 centurions who stood against him, pressing forward even as wounds accumulated on his body, even as it became clear that his forces were being overwhelmed by Roman numbers and discipline. He fought until he could fight no more, until wounds and exhaustion brought him down, and he died on the battlefield, surrounded by the bodies of his enemies and his comrades, a free man for the last moments of his life, even if freedom meant only the choice of how to die. His body was never found, lost among the thousands of dead that littered the battlefield, denied even the dignity of burial, becoming anonymous in death as he had been in life before his revolt. The battle was a catastrophe for the rebel army. Thousands died fighting, thousands more were captured, and only about 5,000 escaped the immediate slaughter, fleeing north only to run into Pompey's arriving legions, which destroyed them in turn. Pompey, arriving too late to participate in the main battle, nevertheless claimed credit for ending the rebellion by destroying this remnant force, infuriating Crassus, who had done the actual work of defeating Spartacus but now had to share glory with his political rival. The rivalry between Crassus and Pompey over credit for the victory would have lasting consequences for Roman politics. contributing to the tensions that would eventually help destroy the Republic itself. But in the immediate aftermath of the battle, the Romans were concerned not with political disputes but with punishment, with sending a message so terrifying that no slave would ever dare rebel again. Crassus ordered 6,000 captured rebels crucified along the Appian Way, the main road from Capua to Rome, spacing the crosses every 40 yards for over 120 miles, creating a corridor of death that every traveler would have to witness. The crucifixions were slow, agonizing public executions that could take days to kill their victims, and the bodies were left hanging as a warning, rotting in the Italian sun, a testament to Roman power and Roman vengeance. It was one of the largest mass executions in ancient history, a deliberate display of cruelty designed to terrorize the enslaved population, to demonstrate that rebellion would be met not just with death, but with death in its most painful and humiliating form. The message was clear. Rome would tolerate no challenge to the institution of slavery, would employ unlimited violence to maintain the system of human bondage that enriched the elite and powered the economy. Yet even as the crosses lined the Appian Way, even as the rebellion was crushed and its survivors destroyed, the memory of Spartacus and his army lived on, becoming legend, transforming from historical event into symbol and myth. For the Romans, Spartacus became a nightmare figure, the embodiment of their deepest fears about slave revolt, a reminder that the system they depended on rested on violence and could be challenged by those they oppressed. Roman writers struggled to make sense of how a Thracian gladiator had defeated consuls and armies, how slaves had proven capable of such military success. Some attributed supernatural qualities to Spartacus, others emphasized Roman incompetence, but all had to confront the uncomfortable reality that slaves, when organized and led effectively, could threaten Rome itself. The rebellion prompted changes in how Rome managed its slave population, increased military preparations against potential future uprisings, and contributed to growing anxieties about the sustainability of a society built on human bondage. But slavery continued. The economic incentives were too strong, the ideology too entrenched, the alternatives too limited by Roman imagination. The rebellion was crushed, but the fundamental contradictions it exposed remained, and historians argue that the structural problems created by slavery contributed to the Republic's eventual transformation into empire. As military strongmen like Pompey and Caesar would use armies to seize power, armies that were necessary in part because of the constant threat of slave revolt and other challenges to Roman order. For the enslaved people of Rome and throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, Spartacus became something different. A symbol of resistance, proof that rebellion was possible, evidence that slaves could fight and win, at least for a time. The story was passed down through generations, embellished and transformed, losing historical accuracy but gaining emotional and symbolic power. In later centuries, oppressed people would invoke Spartacus's name as inspiration for their own struggles against bondage and tyranny. During the Roman Empire's final centuries, when Christianity spread among slave populations, some saw in Spartacus's willingness to die rather than submit a parallel to their own religious martyrs, though the church itself officially condemned rebellion and preached obedience to earthly masters. After Rome fell, the story survived in fragmentary form, preserved in ancient texts that medieval monks copied even if they did not fully understand or approve of the content. The Renaissance rediscovered Spartacus, and Enlightenment thinkers used his rebellion to critique slavery and tyranny, though often romanticizing or distorting the historical reality. The 19th century saw Spartacus adopted by revolutionary movements, socialists and communists who transformed the Thracian gladiator into a proletarian hero fighting against class oppression, creating myths that said more about their own struggles than about ancient Rome. In the 20th century, Spartacus became a symbol in multiple contexts. The Spartacist League in Germany took his name for their communist uprising. The Soviet Union portrayed him as an early revolutionary. Hollywood created an epic film that used the ancient rebellion to comment on contemporary issues of freedom and resistance to tyranny. Each generation, each movement, Each ideology found in Spartacus what they needed: a rebel, a hero, a martyr, a revolutionary, a freedom fighter, proof that resistance was possible even against overwhelming odds. The historical Spartacus, the actual Thracian gladiator who led a slave rebellion in 73 to 71 BC, is difficult to recover from beneath these layers of legend and appropriation, yet his achievement remains extraordinary by any measure. With no formal training in leading armies, no political organization, no external support, no resources beyond what his forces could capture or create, Spartacus built a military force that defeated Roman legions repeatedly over 2 years, controlled large portions of Italy, and came closer to threatening Rome itself than any domestic enemy since Hannibal. He demonstrated organizational genius in creating an army from desperate, diverse people who shared only their bondage. He showed tactical brilliance in repeatedly outmaneuvering and defeating trained Roman commanders. He displayed strategic vision in attempting to lead his followers to freedom beyond Roman borders rather than embarking on impossible conquest. His rebellion exposed the fundamental instability of slave societies, the violence required to maintain them, and the human cost of systems built on treating people as property. The rebellion also revealed something profound about human nature and the desire for freedom. That people subjected to brutal oppression will sometimes choose to fight even when victory is nearly impossible. That the dream of liberty can motivate incredible courage and sacrifice. That human dignity persists even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. The gladiators and slaves who followed Spartacus knew they were almost certainly marching to their deaths, knew that Rome would never forgive their rebellion, knew that capture meant crucifixion, yet they chose to fight anyway, chose freedom even if it lasted only days or weeks, chose dignity even knowing the cost. This is perhaps Spartacus's true legacy. Not military victories or political changes which prove temporary, but the enduring example of resistance, the demonstration that rebellion is possible, that the oppressed need not passively accept their oppression, that sometimes the choice to fight for freedom is worth making even when the odds of success are vanishingly small. In death, Spartacus and his army achieved something they could not achieve in life. They became immortal, their names and deeds preserved not in stone monuments erected by grateful societies, but in the memories and imaginations of people throughout history who faced their own struggles for freedom and justice. The cross-lined Appian Way was meant to terrorize and silence, to end the rebellion not just physically but symbolically, to erase the very possibility of slave revolt from human imagination. Yet the attempt failed because stories cannot be killed, because symbols cannot be crucified, because the idea that slaves could challenge Rome lived on long after the men who embodied that challenge had died. 2,000 years after Spartacus fell in battle, his name remains known while most of his enemies are forgotten. The praetor who first underestimated him, the consuls he defeated, even Crassus who finally crushed the rebellion are remembered primarily for their role in the Spartacus story rather than for their own achievements. This is history's final irony. The slave who was supposed to be nobody, the gladiator who was supposed to die anonymous in the arena, the rebel who was supposed to be erased from memory, became instead one of the most famous figures of ancient history, his life and death subjects of countless books, films, plays, and political movements, his name synonymous with resistance to oppression. The Third Servile War, as Roman historians called it, ended in military defeat and mass execution, but in the longer perspective of history, it might be argued that Spartacus achieved a kind of victory after all, not the victory he sought, freedom for himself and his followers, but a different victory. Proof that the system could be challenged, inspiration for future rebels, and a permanent challenge to ideologies that justify treating human beings as property. His rebellion did not end Roman slavery, which persisted for centuries more, but it exposed the violence and instability inherent in slave systems, demonstrated that slaves were human beings capable of extraordinary achievements, and created a symbol that has inspired resistance movements throughout subsequent history. In the end, perhaps this is enough. Perhaps this is all any rebel can hope for, to fight, to resist, to demonstrate that oppression need not be accepted as natural or inevitable, to inspire others who will follow, to become a story that survives when the storyteller does not. Spartacus and his army died, but their rebellion lived on, transformed from history into legend, from military campaign into moral statement, from failed revolt into enduring symbol. The crosses along the Appian Way eventually rotted and fell. The bodies decomposed and returned to the earth. But the story remained, passed from generation to generation, changing and evolving but never dying, never fully conquered, never truly defeated. This is the strange alchemy of history, how defeat can become victory, how death can become immortality, how a Thracian gladiator who lost his war in 71 BC could win his place in human memory forever. Rome destroyed Spartacus's body, but it could not destroy his legacy. It killed the man, but it could not kill what he represented. 2,000 years later, across a world Rome could never have imagined, people still speak the name of the slave who dared to rebel, still draw inspiration from his courage, still see in his doomed fight for freedom something noble and necessary and true. The rebellion that began in a gladiatorial school in Capua, that spread across Italy, that threatened the foundations of Roman power, that ended in blood and crosses and mass execution, continues to echo through history, a reminder that the human desire for freedom cannot be permanently suppressed, that resistance is always possible, that sometimes the choice to fight is its own reward regardless of outcome. Spartacus rose from nothing, from slavery and anonymity, challenged the greatest empire of the ancient world, fought armies and defeated consuls, led tens of thousands on a desperate march toward freedom, and though he fell in the end, though his rebellion was crushed and his followers killed, his story survived, his name lived on, and his legacy continues to inspire those who struggle against oppression in every age. This is the true story of Rome's most dangerous slave rebellion, not a tale of ultimate triumph but of courage in the face of impossible odds, of dignity maintained in dehumanizing circumstances, of the eternal human struggle for freedom and justice against systems designed to deny both. Spartacus rose, fought, and fell, but in falling he created something that could not be destroyed. A legend of resistance that has outlived the empire that tried to erase it, a symbol of rebellion that has inspired humanity for 2 millennia, a name that still resonates with power and meaning across cultures and centuries. In the blood-soaked sand where he died, among the broken bodies of his comrades and enemies, a truth was born that Rome tried desperately to suppress but could never quite kill. That slaves were human beings, that human beings desire freedom, and that no amount of violence can permanently destroy that desire or prevent its occasional eruption into open rebellion. This was Spartacus's gift to history, purchased with his life and the lives of his followers, justified or not by the immediate outcome but validated by the centuries of inspiration it has provided. The gladiator who became a rebel, the slave who became a general, the man who became a legend, died on a battlefield in Lucania, but in dying he achieved an immortality that no Roman consul, no wealthy slave owner, no powerful senator could match, for he died free, having chosen his fate, having fought for something larger than himself, having demonstrated that even the powerless can sometimes challenge the powerful, that even the oppressed can sometimes terrify their oppressors, that even the doomed can sometimes achieve greatness. This is why we remember Spartacus, why his name has survived when so many others have been forgotten, why his story continues to matter 2,000 years after he lived and died. Because he represents something fundamental about the human spirit, something that cannot be enslaved or killed or suppressed no matter how much violence is brought to bear against it. He represents the idea that we are more than what others make of us, that we can choose to resist even when resistance seems futile, that we can fight for freedom even when freedom seems impossible, that we can maintain our humanity even in circumstances designed to destroy it. Spartacus rose, and in rising, he lifted all who came after, all who heard his story, all who drew courage from his courage and strength from his struggle. The rebellion failed, but the rebel succeeded in becoming something more than human, something symbolic and eternal, something that could not die even when the man himself fell. This is the final truth of Rome's most dangerous slave rebellion. It was dangerous not because it nearly succeeded militarily, not because it killed consuls and defeated legions, but because it demonstrated a truth that slave societies cannot afford to acknowledge, that slaves are human beings with dignity, agency, and the capacity to resist their oppression. Rome killed Spartacus and crucified his followers, but it could not kill the truth they embodied, could not crucify the idea they represented, and that truth, that idea, has haunted slave owners and oppressors throughout history. A ghost that cannot be laid to rest, a memory that cannot be erased, a symbol that continues to inspire those who struggle for freedom and justice in every age and every land. In the end, perhaps Spartacus won after all. Not the victory he sought on earth, but a victory in history's long memory. Not freedom for himself, but inspiration for countless others. Not survival for his body, but immortality for his name and deeds. The crosses have long since fallen. The bodies have long since returned to dust. But the story remains, the legend persists, and the name Spartacus still rings out across the centuries as a call to resistance. A symbol of freedom, and a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, even against the most overwhelming odds, the human spirit can rise, can fight, can choose dignity over submission, can dare to dream of freedom even when freedom seems impossible. This was Spartacus's rebellion. This was his legacy. This was his gift to all who would come after. The knowledge that resistance is possible, that slaves are human, that freedom is worth fighting for even when the cost is everything, even when the outcome is death, even when the world seems arrayed against you with all its power and violence and certainty.